trying to find the little share button here somewhere. It disappeared. It'll take a second. Thank you very much for your patience. Do you see the share screen?
No.
Okay, I found it. Okay, here we go. Share. Do you see it? Yep. Okay, great. Today is arguably, from a movement and historic standpoint, the most important day, this gathering. We are going to be celebrating the founders of the movement that we are part of. And we're going to recognize the new leadership, the youthful leadership that is emerging, because the single most important thing in a movement is succession, as Xi Jinping well knows. We're all here because 40% of all energy and 40% of all emissions go to and come from buildings. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm a 40 years architect and urbanist, a PhD in modern design history and theory, designer of Grand Central Madison, worked on DFW Terminal D, founder of the DC chapter of the ICAA, which Andres Duany made sure I made that happen, and the Classic Planning Institute, author of The Art of Classic Planning, which was designed as a manual for our grandchildren and their grandchildren, when they're going to need to reconstitute cities and rebuild communities. The Classic Planning Institute is sprang from that. We have a library, a laboratory, an academy, a studio, and a stoa. And I'll tell you just in very, very quickly about the Classic Planning Studio. We provide services in eye tracking and neuroaesthetics, facilitated consensus with an equity-oriented approach. Our Anacostia River Master Plan in the last year was, it sort of started again. We're not sure exactly where it's going to go, but it is gathering interest once again. We worked on growing while staying the same, leveraging authenticity and beauty to mature fabric. We are working with people in the Jerusalem municipality and the Jerusalem Institute on a 100-year plan for Jerusalem, starting with these holistic analyses. You can see here, Jerusalem is the red line, Manhattan is the shaded area, the green is Paris, and the blue is Rome within the walls. Paris has twice as many people as Jerusalem does. Manhattan has one and a half times as many. So you can see the lack of efficiency in that system. We're working not from a problem-solving approach, which creates more problems, but from an aspirational approach, last tried in 1922, and that immediately translates into urban design guidelines if you know the right questions to ask the people with regard to their aspirations, and that translates into a classic plan code. This is a neighborhood code for a whole entire neighborhood. I'm not going to go into the details of that yet. It's based on the architecture, so we're developing new architectures for Jerusalem. And in fact, Jerusalem has no problems. People just have to do the right thing. We're also working in California on some house projects, trying to do stuff in styles that are appropriate to Napa City. And in the Classic Planning Laboratory in this last year, we published an article, "This sequences what happens in your brain when you walk down the street." The neuroscience that is emerging right now, you heard yesterday, the 5 rings of neuroscience, which have to do with the hand-eye nexus, with that memory is locational, the whole aesthetic business, how we perceive movement and what animals mean in terms of our evolution, and if that actually impacts how we see cars. It could be that we perceive cars as animals. Classic Planning Library Project, we did a lot of research this last year, and there'll be news on that. Classic Planning Academy, you know very well already. The STOA is in the middle of our so-called building, and one of these days it will be a building. And we are here with really unique values that architecture is central to urbanism, that a genuinely holistic approach actually is the way to move forward. It's about cause. It's not about effect. Walkability and sustainability are effects of doing things right. They're not causes of anything. Town and country and the balance thereof, and the business that crafts may be essential for individual societal and planetary well-being, even balance. We witness today, as a matter of course, strange, intentional stuff. Hard to understand why anybody would want to do anything like that. And we're already deep in the future. It's all happening around us. Everything that was predicted in the 70s, starting with Toffler and thereon after, is here now. We have 4 of the 30 things ongoing already, if not more of them. And we continue to, societally, we continue to do all the 21st century errors, forgetting the human, blind belief in technology, selling strangeness as progress and annihilating beauty. But we know very well that if we understand people, buildings, and cities, we can ask for what we deserve. So I want to welcome you to the Classic Planning STOA Tag 23. And our standard housekeeping, we read it already before the session started. Buras, do you mind reading these alternatively with me?
Sure, no problem.
Alternately?
Ground rule 1. The traditional architecture gathering environment is one of open-mindedness and quality of discourse. Participants are encouraged to debate each other's idea from positions of mutual respect and good manners.
Ms. Hogg, are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, Alison, ladies
Yes.
first.
Okay, number 2. By joining a session or online thread, you agree to avoid ad hominem statements regarding individuals present or absent and sectarian, religious, partisan, political, or aesthetic ideologies for their own sake.
In case of a disagreement, we believe that all statements are made in our community must first be heard, and then the parties submit to the mediation until cordiality is resumed, or the point of "I can live with this."
Session leaders and/or moderators will perform the duty of umpire of their own sessions. Infractions will lead to a warning, followed by ejection from a session upon a second occurrence.
Judgment calls may not be questioned in real time. Session infractions will be addressed within 48 hours of the event closing by a quorum of 3 event organizers as elected by the organizing committee, agreed upon once entering the session.
Thank you very much. You're all under an audience media release. Please, if you disagree with this, please leave. Continuing education, our producer is going to post at the end of each session a poll. Please fill it out. It's a questionnaire for you to get your CEUs. Worst case scenario, send them to us at cgiclassicplanning.com, but try to fill out the forms as they appear. I want to very much thank our Tag 23 volunteers, Miss Alison Hogg, who's a board member of the CPI, Aaron Holt from FFKR, Cecilia Kent from Street Level in Sydney, and Imo Voresh from Oldenburg in Germany. Also, the supporting CPI staff who's been working on Tag 23, Tasneem Zraikat, Zareen Rafadia, and Angela Kapp, and the organizing committee, Roger Jackson, FAIA from FFKR, Pablo Alvarez Funes, RIBA from London, Phil Esikoff in DC, FAIA from Esikoff Studio Gensler, and myself. And last but not least, our very, very, very generous sponsors, Arbon Precast Stone, thank you, Alan Macy, Architectural Polymers, AP Formliner, Marshall Walters, thank you so much for the beautiful work you do. And Phil Nelson from Betterstone, and happy fatherhood. He had a child yesterday, or a child was born unto him. However, it's the right way to say it. He and his wife had a kid, a new kid. Betterstone, Alabama Stone, thank you very much. They can build anything. The community support, thank you very much for all your supporters. Vosh, do you want to read the honors? Do the honors, please, thank you.
Sure. Platinum, Jonathan Smith. Gold, Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk. Bruce Donnelly, Christopher Andrews. Silver, Chris Fagan, Patrick Westu, James Evarts, Sean Perry, Christopher Weeks, James Dorothy, Abraham Culhern, Isabella Tinifana, I'm sorry for that, Bronze, Bartul Al-Musawi, Milena Kirkelis-Binger, and David Broussard. Sorry for getting the names a little wrong or mispronouncing them. Thank you for your contribution.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, sir. Today, we're going to do 4 things. We're going to celebrate the founders of the movement. These are the people who have inspired us for the last 40 years. We're going to recognize the young emerging leadership. These are extraordinary young people, really carrying the torch of human knowledge with regard to the built environment forward. We're going to hear our closing keynote. It's going to be by Witold Rybczynski, and it's Why Ornament Matters. And I think that this is one of the great things about this tag. It's not exclusively about traditional architecture. We are broadening the spectrum to people in the modernist camp, if you will, who actually have sensibilities or emerging sensibilities that are more human and less machine oriented. And then some of our people, led by Daniel Morales, are going to respond with regard to why ornament matters. And I think that will be a really great place to bring the Tag 23 to an end. We are going to celebrate I think it's 10 people. We're going to celebrate 10 people who have really made a huge difference in the world, in the institutions they established and in their work. They have really devoted their lives so far to this movement. And we're going to start with 3 people that I know are not here. Henry Hope Reed was the leader, single-handedly the leader of the traditional movement in the 50s and 60s in the United States. After the fall of Penn Station, he's the man who saved Grand Central, which I had the great, great honor of working on, and really getting to start to understand what architecture was. I think that was the first building I really studied and looked at enough to start understanding what we're doing. I would like to, rather than rattle off some kind of biography, if anybody here knew him well, and I think we have several people who might, certainly Richard Cameron, but maybe someone else is here. Maybe Alvin is here. Is Alvin here? Alvin Holme?
I was gonna suggest Steve Sims near, because I think Steve's on.
Is he here? Is Steve here?
I just tried to contact Alvin and he didn't respond, but I'm going to see if he can join us. He was here on Friday for a little while.
Yes, I saw him yesterday, I thought as well. So Richard, I think you're the closest, or Andres and Liz
Well,
probably.
I'm happy to say something briefly about Henry, because Henry was so crucial to me personally, and I know to many of us that got inspired to take the leap into embracing classicism fully, and particularly the Beaux-Arts in America, and as it came from Paris. And I knew Henry personally, fairly well, not super well, and he and Arthur Ross, who, and then others, Alvin Holme, John Blateau, but classical America was such a beacon. When I first was introduced to it in Toronto by my teacher, Michael Georgievich, I was flabbergasted. We did some of the early competitions. We came to New York and met Richard Sammons and Anne and all of those people. And in fact, the Institute of Classical Architecture was born out of a desire to try and keep classical America going. So, and Henry had so many different, aspects to his career. I mean, all the important books, the book on the New York Public Library, which, I'd argue is still probably the most important book on American classical architecture ever written, that was recently republished along with the Golden City, which of course, I remember reading the Golden City when I was an undergraduate in Toronto and being banned from even looking at classical buildings, and realized that if I had the money, I would have just bought a copy and put it on the desk of every student at the School of Architecture in Toronto.
When you want, but
anyway, Henry was an astonishing, important leader, and is still to this day not nearly well enough recognized for the role he played, both within this movement and more broadly culturally. He was a good friend of Jackie Kennedy. He knew Philip Johnson well. It could go on and on and on. So that's sort of my quick.
Thank
But
you.
I wish, and I'm so thrilled that you're recognizing him today because, he's the real originator. Back in the 50s, when no one was talking about any of this, Henry was out giving his tours of Central Park, and the kernels of what became classical America were started there when he was the Central Park conservator.
Yes, I think also what's making us special today is that we're also recognizing the people as a group, because all of them have received unlimited awards and prizes and recognitions from various and sundry institutions individually. But the idea that we actually, if we're a church, these are our saints, I like to say. So together with him in classical America is still with us, Alvin Holme. Alvin, are you here? Would anybody like to say something about Alvin Holme? Then if I may, I had a chance, I was very lucky to have worked with him. He is one of the gentlest, wisest, and best teachers of architecture ever. He is a fine architect who truly understands wielding the classical method with a genuine heart for crafts and an understanding of the whole shebang. He has done some remarkable work. Probably the most significant of it might have been teaching at the ICAA. He's the man who taught me Corinthian order, and he started out by teaching the acanthus leaf, and I thought that was absolutely brilliant. I mean, as a teacher, he was brilliant. As an architect, he is great. Still teaching, and I want to recognize him as one of the underpinnings of the movement. Thank you, Alvin, for being there. There are a lot of people here who actually knew and studied with. So would you all like to raise your hands, all the people who were direct students of Christopher Alexander, and maybe one or two of you say some things about Professor Alexander? Nikos, do you want to say something about Christopher Alexander? Does anybody hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, Nikos.
I think
Chris
he stepped
Andrews?
away near. He put something in the chat.
Here you are. Christopher, Nikos, would you like to say something about Christopher Alexander, please?
Well, I can say a lot, but what exactly do you want to hear?
The 3-minute, why I love him, what he did for us, what his vision was, and what he would think of the world today.
He was very disappointed with the world. What he did for us is to focus architecture and urbanism on the human scale, on human emotions, to get away from the imposition of abstract ideas and formalism, and to reorient architecture using a toolkit that classical architects know that makes you feel more healthy. Fortunately, we have the classical architecture tradition, which is a toolkit that evolved from making the user feel healthy. But somehow it has evolved into a set of rules. Now, non-classical modernist architects have taken the idea of a formalism and have abused it by making an abstract formalism that they apply and bully everyone into accepting. But the origins of classical architecture are adaptability and evolution of all the form language, the details, the ornamentation, in order to make people feel good and feel healthy unconsciously. So Christopher emphasized this, and all his work was focused on developing a toolkit that is not style specific. So he did not align himself with the classical form language, not at all. He tried to find the pieces of a form language from all cultures around the world that can be used locally and combined in order to give a wonderful healing environment. And his own buildings, sometimes they hit it, sometimes they missed it, but certainly all his writings come back to this, the absolute need for the psychological health of the user and as a prerequisite to any design. So I tried my role. I tried to make a bridge between Christopher and traditional practitioners. Christopher felt uncomfortable with people exclusively applying the classical form language. Classical practitioners felt uncomfortable with Christopher going off into very abstract discussion. But I tried while Christopher was in good health to bridge the little gap, and I thank Near for contributing to this, and other people like Michael Mahaffey, people in Building Beauty. We still have not bridged the gap, but if people who practice the traditional form language get a better grasp of what Christopher tried to do, I think they would find in Christopher's work many helpful bits. Christopher did not give a design tool. That's what the classical form language does. It gives you a design tool. It's very efficient. Andres Duany at the beginning of today's session emphasized the need for efficiency, speed. We need to build a building for 1 million inhabitants right away in 3 months. Well, Christopher was never able to develop an efficient way of design, and even Near criticized this, and I agree totally with Near, because when Near was a student, he was presented with a pattern language, and he thought, well, let me use this to design. Well, you cannot use it to design. It helps you to make more human designs, but it does not give you a design tool. And an architect who is very practically oriented wants a design tool. Unfortunately, Christopher did not give us the design tool. I think, however, now with Christopher's passing, with all this vast amount of research that's coming in from the medical profession, from neuroscience, what we're doing with artificial intelligence, with visual attention scans, they are filling in that bridge that I tried, and many of my friends tried to build between Christopher and traditional designers. And hopefully we are on the threshold of a new renaissance in designing buildings, interiors, public spaces, cities that are oriented towards giving the user the best possible psychological and physiological health.
Thank you, Nikos. That's beautiful. Thank you very much. What we have asked the founders, our celebrant founders, was to tell us about their own experience, rather than us read something that is like a New York Times obituary, to actually tell us what drove them, what brought them to the field, who the people were that influenced them the most, who are the people who they felt they passed on the most to, where they think the movement is today, and what their view is of the future. And the first person that I would like to ask with regard to this is Leon Krier. Leon, are you here?
Leon is here. Hello,
He's
Leon.
here. He just has to unmute himself.
Okay, Leon.
Yes, hello. Sorry.
Hello.
Was distracted, but I lost your screen. Hello, Nia. Hello, everyone. So where are we?
Well, that's what we're asking you. Where are we? What drove you to the field in the first place? What did you find we asked the same thing of all of you. What do you think are your accomplishments? It's not about humble brag. It's really about really looking back. I think all of you have done so much. Of the many things that you've done, what to you is the most significant personally? And what do you think where we're headed and what the future might be like?
Seeing where architecture goes, because after nearly a year at university, I noticed that there was nothing to learn. And so I joined the office of Jim Sterling, and because I was looking for a master, and I thought that Corbusier had been the last master, he was dead. So I thought, looking through magazines, that Sterling was the only one who had some kind of genius for at least for one building, the Leicester engineering faculty. And so I sent him my drawings and he accepted me. But then I noticed over 3 years that he was no master. He had no clue where he was going. He had done this extraordinary building of Leicester, which was not very well built, but it's very interesting in every sense. And I thought this is the start of a new form of classicism, where there's a typological and formal coherence, where you can read a building without contradiction, and all this Venturi nonsense was here denied in a single blow. But it turned out that he had no clue where he was going. He asked me to design 10,000 people headquarters for Munich Perlach for Siemens. And he had no clue what to do. I was in charge. I was 20 years old. They had no clue what, I never designed the city, but I thought, God damn it, 10,000 people, that's a city. So we need to design the city. I had done university design for Bielefeld, which was the same size. And he said, we take that and we take it to Munich. And I thought, but that was 2 years ago. This is no city. We need to design a city. But he always asked, what image? What's the image? The city, but that's not an image, he said. I had to look in the dictionary. I wasn't very good at English. I had to look at the dictionary to find out what does image mean. But this was a kind of level on which then the most advanced, and he was certainly the most advanced of the modernists, were operating, and it went much worse from there. Because while I was doing projects, for me, the most important read was Camillo Sitter. It was like a real blow. It is really, to understand not only what town planning, what cities, what architecture is about, but it opened my eyes to where I had grown up. And the enormous chance I had to come from. My father was a tailor. They had tailoring business. They were craftsmen, and I grew up in a near perfect city. And I went to school in a near perfect town, but which was new because it had been rebuilt after the war. It was called Echternach, was a famous city which had been bombed by the American artillery, exchanging with the German resistance on the Siegfried line. So we, as children, we saw this city being rebuilt in a craftsman way-like. And it was built until 1954. It was virtually finished with a gigantic basilica, and done by half a dozen of architects. 30 years later, Lucien and I, when we got really acquainted, we wanted to celebrate these people. We went to find them, some of them, and they were ashamed of what they had done. They said, one of them said, go to see the German embassy, on the Route d'Arlon. And it was a disgusting building, had nothing to do with the enormous competence they had demonstrated in rebuilding this old town. So, and then I saw, I can't find the master. And then one day I was living in Berlin. I got the newspaper from Luxembourg saying that in Luxembourg, the park is going to be replaced by parking. Now, the park was a belt around the city, which replaced the bastions and the walls. And so I got really alarmed, and I wrote an article which was then published in a national newspaper, the first time I had done a coherent article. And then I knew, and I tried to involve, I thought, who can we ask for help to save that poor city, which was a fantastic city? And I looked at Aldo Rossi and Ciavalati and even Christopher Alexander, and I thought, these people, they have no clue how to go about conceiving and saving and rebuilding or multiplying, extending a beautiful city. So I thought it fell upon me. God told me, this is your job. People use the term God in many ways, but everyone has a conscience. And I think that's our voice to creation. And so I for 5 years, I worked on this, and thanks God, I had always jobs I was relatively independent and could work on stuff which took most of my time. And I still do that. And I think it's this independence. I never got involved with architects' business because I saw how much effort it was in Sterling's office day and night, for years to do a bad building. I mean, like the Cambridge University Library, which was a bloody mess. Everybody complained already about it. The architects published it worldwide. And I thought, this is certainly not the way I want to perform. I didn't want to add to this garbage, because it was basically an architecture of garbage which multiplied around the world. Yet we come from a background, I grew up in a background which was architecturally, urbanistically, humanly perfect, virtually perfect as humankind can go. And so I thought that's where we have to learn. And my father was a craftsman, so my brother, I had also a brother who was a genius, I mean, an incredible artist. And so it's then to enthusiasm and then retrospection on what we had lived and the daily life we had, which was fantastic in these towns and society, that then I started to be extremely critical of what I, of what I read in Le Corbusier. And despite me thinking he's a great architect, a great genius, an artistic genius, but a horrible architect, and did horrible architectural and urbanistic work because he didn't understand. He didn't understand the continuity we had to be in order to contribute to architecture of urbanism. He wanted to innovate, and Sterling wanted to innovate, Mies wanted to innovate. And that is where there was an absolute cul-de-sac, which I thought we have to reconnect. And then I got interested in the work of Raymond Erith, but Raymond Erith was dead. I tried to contact Quinlan Terry, and then I lost most of my friends in London because I was interested in Quinlan Terry. They said, when I informed myself, who is this Quinlan Terry? They said, oh, but he's a Christian. It was something against the law, to be Christian. And I went to find him, and he was not very interested in publicity. I tried to publish him more. And but it was like that. And then particularly the meeting with Maurice Culot in Brussels was very strongly engaged in making counter projects against the destruction of Brussels. And when he became with students, I became an advisor of students how to integrate new development instead of building skyscrapers, and how the same build must be integrated in a continuous urban fabric. Then this became so dangerous that the minister closed the school. We founded a new school, École de la Reconstruction de la Ville Européenne, the reconstruction of the European city. And after 1 year, that had to be closed because the ministry refused to credit the best students we had taken from the La Cambre. And so Maurice then went to Paris and became director of history in the Institut Français d'Architecture. But then many people around, another person who was extremely important to me was Cervelati, even though I had very to do, but the saving of Bologna's urban fabric, not only of the buildings, but also of the social effect, the shops and the craftsmen who lived, and how you restore town without demolishing it socially. It was very important. And it's all these different, and the idea of the urban quarter, which he used very, he wrote a book called Morfologia della Città. I learned Italian just to read this book. And so there were many people in different directions who had contributed this, but there was no general theory. And I thought the most important thing to oppose a general decay and destruction of architecture and urbanism, that we need a general theory which is good in any country, in any climate, in any continent, because we are on one planet. And I think that we have done that together with, I then was invited around. I met people like Andres and Jack Robertson, and the networking, and partly Andres was this kind of global systemic viewing, which enriches the European traditional architecture with the American town, which has its, Charleston, and have the contribution to the idea of the European city, which we were celebrating. from there, it went on. And then you find out that there are many people around the world. We also tried to connect with classical America. I went to see Henry O'Brien. He didn't want me to come to see him. So I said, I come to see you just out of modesty, because I didn't want to, impose. And he didn't want to, he wanted to come to the hotel. So I finally insisted, no way do you come here. I have to come to you. I want something from you. So I went to find him, and I couldn't believe, I thought, classical America, Henry Hope Reed, the Golden City, he must have a fantastic office on top of a skyscraper overlooking New York. No, he had a horrible little office somewhere tucked in the backside of a mews of some alleyway. And which made you understand how little this resistance, how little space was left of this resistance we were building. But I think then, of course, the interest of the Prince of Wales and then Project Poundbury and Seaside. Poundbury would never have happened without Seaside, because Seaside was the only place where I had done one house. At the Prince's organization, they said, but he has no clue. So I could show one, or the Prince showed them one house, which I had in Seaside. So this is networking, I think, which is important, which is now very, very strong. And around the world is, there's very capable people. When you look at the Driehaus Prize book with all the candidates, 400 pages of fantastic buildings. It's difficult now to decide, because there are such good people, young and old. And so I think I'm quite hopeful, but I think the world is in a mess, and particularly this idiotic politics of so-called anti-fascism and so-called anti-racism and equity and all this nonsense. It's really deconstructing the last bit of Western civilization which was left. And this sexual nonsense, of men are now women, I think is absolutely scandalous. There's nothing to do with nature of possible new order, which would be more just, or this climate nonsense. I mean, I just can't buy it. So rather, I'm very optimistic about what we are doing, because I think if we would impose, and I even say now, work for anyone, even for criminals, if they let you do the classical traditional city, it's better than the rest. So something they do right, because we are getting always attacked of being extreme right, or I don't know. The important thing is that the criminals leave a good city behind, because that's what they did in the past. Now, most kings were criminals.
Yeah, Medici were pigs.
And all our politicians, all our main politicians are criminals now. I mean, funding the war against the Russians is a crime against humankind. And of course, you have to say, then Putin is devil, so we fight the war. I think we're in a situation which is really apocalyptic. Huh? I recommend all read René Girard. So
I really hope it doesn't become apocalyptic.
It is apocalyptic. Read René Girard, the last book. Clausewitz.
The thing is, we're looking at a world today where we have new machinery that really could wipe out everything even more effectively than nuclear arms. But I really want to thank you for taking us through this really extraordinary path and leading by example. I think that's the big lesson I get from you, is leading by example, in terms of, if you find something you're passionate about, to go ahead and actually follow that path and follow it effectively, consistently.
By the way, they mistake in your, I think 2 mistakes in your sentence.
Thank you.
Fiat lux, etc.
Really?
It's Fiat.
Yeah.
Oh, Fiat.
Quite right either.
Thank you. All right. Why, that's marvelous.
I studied Latin for 8 years.
Okay. They will be corrected, and thank you very, very much.
Thanks.
I want to, Leon mentioned 2 people, Liz and Andres, without whom I myself also would not be here. I think all of us owe them a great thank you. And thank you so much, Liz, for being here and being a constant reminder of goodness in things. Would you like to share with us some of your thoughts?
Thank you, Neer. First of all, I noted that you talked about us as a group and how interesting it might be put this group together of those who are here and those who are not. Honored to be among the group that you've gathered. I will touch on just a few of the points that you asked us to, the beginnings, because the personal is always interesting. My interest in what I'm doing now started with my father, who was an architect, probably important for my generation. When in architecture, that there needed to be a way of understanding the profession in advance of selecting to study it. There were very few women in my classes at university at that time, because of course, you know, that was a very long time ago. But my father's great influence was the beautiful work that he was doing, actually his moonlighting on the renovations, the revivals, restorations of Pennsylvania farmhouses. We were living in the suburbs of Philadelphia, and was bringing to life beautiful, small, old stone buildings, which later, with Vince Scully's teachings, I would understand, relied entirely on a sense of proportion. Everyone, the public in general, thought the stone might be their most appealing aspect, and I understood that actually it was that part of the design that many people do not see but appreciate. Anyway, the pencil drawings on a drawing board just were an absolutely sensual, luscious object for me as a child, and I determined that I would, or I wanted to engage that as I grew up. So those were the beginnings. And part of that were visits to some of the wonderful towns, the historic towns on the East Coast, because my father, who'd been educated in Europe, really had a great appreciation for them, which he passed on to me. So those were the beginnings. In terms of looking back now, I think one of the great satisfactions or pleasures, I do not take personal credit for it in any way, but I'm part of, as you said, a group which has been described in many ways these several days. But my work on the new urbanism makes me understand that part of what that group has done is to make a safe space for traditional and classical architecture. Yes, John Milner was designing individual traditional buildings that would be scattered in the countryside or in the suburbs during my youth. That's what I remember. Or I once encountered a family in the suburbs of St. Louis hand building a pegged salt box reproduction of a New England, early New England house. And these were the kind of isolated first or continuing efforts of traditional work in the US. And I think it's really wonderful that the new towns and the revivals of places that the urban designers have worked on in the last 30 years have made a place where the efforts of traditional and classical architecture can be accumulated to make places that are greater than the mere sum of their parts. And so that's part of what you've just been hearing about, is people networking and working together in the same direction. And I do think, of course, there's a lot more to do, but we can all look back on that, if not with satisfaction because the work is not yet done, or perhaps not enough has been done, but certainly with a great deal of visual pleasure that it exists. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's amazing how everyone has their own origin story with regard to how they got here. I'd like to thank you so much for your words. And as we are fixing our beautiful certificates, I think it's time to hear Andres is the one who called us all to come down from the Citadel and charge in the plains. Andres, where are you?
Well, thank you, Nia, for organizing this. It's an institution that's being built at a tremendous rate. This is the second meeting, and it seems like an ancient tradition already. Can
It's the
everybody
third
hear me?
meeting.
Third meeting. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Okay. I would like to support what Leo and Elizabeth said with a slightly different emphasis, and then take it on to the next generation or what their role might be. Leo, one way to say to mention this succinctly is that this is a movement as opposed to a series of individual, what came to be called star architects. And it's extraordinary how the positions of modernism and traditionalism have changed, because the original modernism was a movement. It was CM. It was supposed to be relatively, the ideas were shared. And now they have become the grands artistes, the great people who are individuals. And in fact, what qualifies them is that they don't do anything that anybody else does. The minute somebody has an accomplishment, that's the one thing that cannot be copied. It belongs to Frank Gehry. It belongs to to Richard Meyer. And so they continually sterilize tradition by not allowing themselves to learn from each other. In contrast, the traditionalists are a movement, which is what modernism was meant to be. And it is the greatest pleasure for me, at least, to see that I'm in a cohort of like-minded people. And that furthermore, I am very stimulated by the fact that they're opponents, which is always more than, I enjoy that more than people who celebrate us. It's more stimulating. I also know that there's still more to be found. Okay, there's still more to be explored. It is still not fixed. And I wish to approach that with a kind of metaphorical story. But before I do that, I'd like to differentiate the very first generation of classicists, traditionalists, and our generation, Lizz's and mine, et cetera, and the new urbanists. The original generation involved people like Alan Greenberg and Bob Stern and Leo Krier, who was the youngest among them, and Michael Graves. And if you look at the early buildings, we get a feeling of how difficult it was to recover traditionalism from a completely lost basis of knowledge. They literally did not know how to do anything. They didn't know. They were like, Peter Calthorpe once put it, I think beautifully, when he said, it's as if the world had had a stroke and had lost its language. And slowly the language of architecture was recovered. And those early buildings of Stern and the Graves building in Portland, the very early buildings, really of everyone, the early buildings of Rob Krier and Alan Greenberg, were really, we look at them and we're embarrassed. They were awful. They're mildly interesting, but they were really the attempt to recover tradition. And I think we should look upon them as evidence of how difficult it was and how lost it was. Probably the single most, I think, the clearest career is Alan Greenberg's, who went from a kind of Alvar Aalto, modernist Alvar Aalto, through Venturi, through his own very early postmodernist work to straight classicism in a campaign that probably took a decade. It was absolutely heroic. Absolutely heroic. And many of them suffered for it. They were, the opprobrium of the profession was extraordinary. They were very brave people, and they're probably only a handful. And I think we should remember them differently from those of us who came later, essentially the Guild and the New Urbanists and the ICA, who were already a movement, and it was a much safer, we had a different role. Now, I'd like to just make a metaphor that takes us to the next generation. Liz and several other people, John Massingale has told me that the work presented yesterday, I think it was yesterday, by the young architects from all over the world was really magnificent. It was incredibly accomplished. And this came into me because I wasn't watching, but I would ask them, I said, look, I have to participate tomorrow. What's going on? And they said, the work is magnificent. I'll say that that work by young architects is magnificent because the tradition hasn't fully recovered. It can actually be dependably taught so that 25 and 27 and even 20-year-olds in Notre Dame can do excellent traditional building. Okay, that's a tradition that has been recovered completely. That's the evidence. Now I'm going to make a metaphor that has to do with cars, automobiles. Let us imagine that a bunch of mechanics, quite in the post-war, went to a barn and discovered a bunch of parts, just car parts all over the place. And slowly, without an instruction book, there were no instruction books. What do we do with these parts? And they slowly assembled it, found that those parts actually made a Ferrari. It was a Ferrari, it was a magnificent race car. And they assembled it. And this is the metaphor of the first generation of classicists. Now, the second generation of classicists was asked to polish it, which is the new urbanists. What we did is we polished it. We learned how to produce it. Now there's a third generation. And what the third generation is asked to do is to worship it. Literally, leave it in the barn. Don't touch it. We know how it's done. Just polish that Ferrari. When really what's required is to take that Ferrari that is not only beautiful, but has extraordinary performance and take it to the edge of the precipice. You have to figure out, you have to show to the world what classicism can do, okay? And it isn't just sitting around, worshiping 5 Renaissance treatises. There have been over 100 treatises that I have looked at very closely, and they all exist in order to move the discourse forward. They were expensive to do, and they were necessary because they wanted to move the discourse, either making it more efficient in the case of the carpenter's manuals, or bringing in all sorts of things that had been left out by the Renaissance classicists. They did their job. And now the time has come to have a different set of heroes. People like Saarinen, people like the Scandinavian classicists, people like Plečnik above all, okay? What happens is that classicism can astonish the world. And it astonishes the world by taking dangers, by being on the edge of the precipice. What Plečnik did was so astounding that it makes Le Corbusier look like somebody who played it safe, okay? And that is the role of the young generation. It is not to simply polish the Ferrari. Once you've learned how to assemble a Ferrari, which is the Renaissance treatises, move on to the additional 60 treatises. Look at the treatises by the insurgents. Look at the people and what they did to classicism and show the world what it can do. Because it can range from the most urban and sophisticated to the most raw and populist, and it can also communicate. The ability of classicism to communicate efficiently, not cross-culturally, but locally. Locally, you can actually restore a French classicism, an Indonesian classicism. You can actually show what a tomb looks like and what a festival hall looks like. And it isn't all the same order. They're all different orders. They're all different compositions. We have a language which is much too narrow. Get over it while we're in school, and in your 20s, just take it on the road. And by the way, what the ICA needs to do is to forgive those who fall off the precipice, because right now, people are terrified of the arched eyebrow of the ICA, okay? Because people make mistakes and they say, oh, well, that's unfortunate. And that terrifies the classicists, okay? We need to take risks. We need to take enormous risks, and we need to be celebrated for the risks that we take and not just how we do things correctly. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very, very much. Really an inspiration. And I think we have our marching orders for the next 20 years, everybody. So I would say let's let's move in that direction. Next up, we have actually in our little convocation here, next up we have Robert Adam, who already received his award on the first day. He's on a job site today. He's unavailable. We fixed the Fiat. I don't know about the Ferrari, but we fixed the Fiat. And it's really, really interesting. But I think we want to hear James Stevens Curl, who back 20, 30 years ago was documenting the classical method and put together his prophet-like book, Making Dystopia, which really documented where we're at now. Thank you for joining us. You have the floor.
Thank you, Nia. I would like to agree with everything that was said about Plečnik. I think I've seen all his buildings, and it proves the versatility of classicism and its way to the future. Well, I, as a child, was happy enough to enjoy a wonderful library, and I became very familiar with great buildings in Dresden and Berlin and other places, my grandfather's library. And then I made the mistake of going to a school of architecture where we were told to read Gropius. And I read a whole lot of guff about scientific objectivity, and I very soon came to the conclusion that Gropius wouldn't understand science if he tripped it. He said that people wear clothes of the modern time, not clothes of the 18th century. So this is the sort of clothing that was worn by teachers at the Bauhaus, something I would have thought was particularly modern. And then, of course, there was Corbusier. I thought that, first of all, there was the deliberate lying, removing pitched roofs from illustrations like this. The lower illustration shows what appears in Corbusier's publication, and the upper illustration shows it actually as it was. And I didn't like the shouted sloganizing in capitals. This sort of cowed people. And the tone of that awful man's publications struck me as being very similar to that of Mein Kampf. There wasn't very much difference. And indeed, when I very much enjoyed the cartoons of Osbert Lancaster, the comparison between the totalitarianism of National Socialism and the totalitarianism of Soviet communism, there wasn't a great deal of difference, except that in the communist version, capitals were eschewed for ideological reasons, as you can see on the right-hand picture. We are told in the hagiographies of Gropius and Mies van der Rohe, as he called himself, that they left Germany as soon as Hitler came to power. Well, they didn't. They joined in the Reichsbank competition. The upper, these two are schemes, one by Mies van der Rohe and the other by Gropius, or rather by Gropius's colleagues. Contrary to popular opinion, there was no ideological style approved of by Hitler. He actually said that you didn't want horse troughs for the modern Autobahn. The top picture shows a typical service station built in the 1930s, the kind of architecture that was approved of for the Autobahn. And the lower picture shows an industrial building which was typical of industrial buildings in the Third Reich. We're also told that Mies van der Rohe stayed, he left Germany quite quickly. In fact, he stayed on until the late 1930s. And in 1934, he signed a proclamation with others supporting Hitler in 1934. There's a detail of his name down at the bottom. And the upper picture shows his resignation from the Prussian Academy of Arts. And you can see that his name is Mies van der Rohe, because Mies in German means something that's mean, crummy, and disagreeable. So he added the diaresis over the E, and Mies means nothing. So he added then the Van der Rohe, which sounds rather grand and reassuringly Dutch. You can see the Heil Hitler over his signature. Can we go on? Oh, doesn't work.
And participant has enabled closed captioning, and I'm going to stop share and reshare.
Okay, sorry about that.
Thank you, John Smiley. And thank
Here to
you,
help.
James.
How to help? No, that's it.
And when I started to see what was happening to towns, it was this kind of thing, which was the direct result of an ideology, the ideology of Corbusier and others who hated the street, who insisted that the land should be handed over to open space and motorways. So we get the ancient monument left marooned on a roundabout, the church marooned, the graveyard, of course, grubbed up. We can't have any reminders of death. The whole thing just becomes a dehumanized mess. And I'm afraid that this kind of thing I saw all around me when traditional towns and cities were wrecked for this kind of thing. That's Osbert Lancaster's take on it. And I was horrified when I saw when small streets of buildings were demolished, that this was what we got in its place. Vast housing schemes, which failed almost as soon as they were built, became hated by their inhabitants, and most of which have had to be demolished only a short time after they've been built, long before their construction costs have been paid off. This struck me as being very peculiar. And when in Manchester, praised by Pevsner as being one of the few places that had actually come up with good public housing, these crescents, as they were called, were named after people like Robert Adam, William Kent, and others. Terrible attempt to join the indefensible with the respectable past. Create the tabula rasa on the one hand and yet claim respectability. Gropius, for example, claimed that he was influenced by Ruskin and by William Morris. Nothing could be further from the truth. There is absolutely no connection at all between anything Gropius believed in and those people. These buildings were designed by Wilson and Womersley. Wilson became president of the RIBA, and the buildings rapidly became one of the most dysfunctional housing estates in all Europe, demolished from 1991 onwards. And in Thamesmead, designed by the Greater London Council Architects Department, when Stanley Kubrick was filming his A Clockwork Orange, the dystopian film of horrible modern future life, he didn't have to build a stage set. He used Thamesmead as the background for the film. I took these pictures with Jeff Brandwood just a few years ago, 2017, actually. You could see the pile of rubbish on the left-hand picture in the foreground. What you can't see are the discarded needles. The upper level walkways, of course, were used by muggers and vandals, but what you can't see is the awful smell of stale urine that hangs over the whole place. This, of course, won awards. Most of it's been demolished. There was huge uproar when these buildings, Robin Hood Gardens in the East End of London, in Tower Hamlets, by the Smithsons, when these were proposed to be demolished, they were also dysfunctional, yet the Smithsons claimed that these would be connected with the classical work of the Woods in Bath. Again, another attempt to claim a respectable background. Well, they have no connection whatsoever with the work of the Woods at Bath. And in fact, this has also been demolished. We've seen the image on the left before. That's my own drawing. And I think that Louis Hellman got it right when he said what the architect was doing to the public. In fact, he was just giving two fingers to it. This is a deliberate, in-your-face piece of work, deliberate uglification. And what does one make of something like this? Award-winning, praise to the skies. We are bullied into thinking that this sort of thing is good. Is it? We were promised by the politicians that the 19th century town would be demolished, and this would be replaced by wonderful new quality of urban life. I think Osbert Lancaster got it absolutely right. What all this taught me was that there was something seriously wrong with architectural education and indeed with architecture generally. I determined, therefore, to follow a different course, to seek in the past the lost language which could be taken forward. I hope that that's given you some sort of background to why I changed the direction and became a historian.
Professor Curl, I would like to pause here for a second. Because we started an hour late to accommodate our European audience, I need to figure out for a second how we are going to move forward. Is Professor Rybczynski here right now? I'm going to call you on the phone to consult with you briefly about your time availability. Do continue, please, Professor Curl. We have several more people, so if you can wrap it up in 2 or 3 minutes, we will be very happy to make our adjustments hereafter. Professor Rybczynski, I'm calling you by phone.
Right. Well, all I want to say is that I've tried to give you a little bit of background to what prompted me to write Making Dystopia, because I felt that something needed to be said. I'd done my work on the Victorians, on the Georgians, on all sorts of aspects of historical work, but I decided to encapsulate all the stuff that I'd read and 60 years of experience, I suppose, professionally in making dystopia. I knew it would cause trouble, but the book has now gone into a Czech translation, a Hungarian translation is being prepared. And although I got a lot of vulgar personal abuse, what I didn't get was anybody who attempted to refute the arguments in the book. And I'm very glad I did it. I could stand over every word I said in the book. I think it has touched chords. Many people seem to have responded to it, and that's great. I suppose now that I've just finished a book on English Victorian churches, which is a very lovely thing, beautifully illustrated, with fine photographs by my friend Jeff Brandwood, who unfortunately died last year. And I'm going to spend my last years, I think, revisiting classicism and doing a new edition of my book on classical architecture as a kind of hopefully useful volume for young people coming through now. It has been a very interesting journey. It's been very rewarding. It's been enriching. And of course,
thank you so much. I screwed up. This is my.
So since Dr. Buras is now in a phone call, thank you very much. And I think Mr. Salingaros has a small comment. And if you don't mind, please, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you. I'm very happy to hear Professor James Stevens Curl. Just a personal note, I'm honored to be one of his friends, and I was involved in writing some reviews of his excellent book, Making Dystopia, and I want to personally vouch for the vicious campaign of slander against Professor Curl, even death threats. Unbelievable story that occurred since the publication of his book. But Professor Curl is here, solid and calm and well collected. But I'm telling the rest of the conference of the horrible things that occurred from the publication of his completely well-researched book. Not a single line has ever been questioned, because Professor Curl is one of the greatest architectural historians of our time. But this is just a dark story, and we should be aware of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
For the record, back in '95, when I was doing my PhD, I came across exactly the same information, and there was nobody in the universe with whom I could share it. Everything that Professor Curl writes is true, 100% true. And this is a history that has not, that until him was not written. So I recommend the book extremely highly. Due to our a screw up this morning, not having figured out that in Europe, the world is still normal, and here we're in the future already in the United States. Our schedule seems to be shifting. So I'm going to ask Mario Woti and her team, if you can please confer with your team. I would like to have, so that we don't discomfort the great Professor Rybczynski too much, if we can have him at 13 in about half an hour, so that we can finish our historic session first, then and then work with Professor Rybczynski, and then our young leadership. Or, and this I really need, I already got Professor Rybczynski to agree to a half an hour delay. Would you, the wonderful young leadership, agree to start your in an hour and a half, to postpone it for an hour and a half? How do you feel about that? Is that too much for you?
Would it possible to keep the original schedule, and our session then would be like half an hour? Would that be possible? No delays.
Professor Rybczynski, could we move you? I'm sorry about this, but could we move to about, I would say about 2:30? Could we move you to 2:30? I think he walked away. Herr Vosch, can you please
Yes.
communicate with Professor Rybczynski?
90 minutes delay for him, right? If it's
90,
okay. 1.5 hours.
yeah, however you do it, a
Okay,
90-minute
you very
delay
much.
for him.
All right.
And very, very kindly asking him if he can do this, how he feels about it. Wow, this is a time zone screw up that we just didn't do. They got us for saying all those nasty things about technology. Oh me, oh my. Okay, let's move forward. Professor Curl.
Yes.
In recognition, you're going to receive and please correct the Latin if there are any more, or anything else, any more typos in here. You're going to receive a parchment. That's actually going to be wrapped like a scroll. It's going to be wrapped in a tube, rolled in a tube on genuine parchment. We're working on, that's our little graphic project. Really want to thank you for staying the course, and in many ways providing a historic keel to bridge the gap between 1900 and, I don't know, 2100, because we're still in process, we're still in solution. We have here in our our little convocation with all of our founders, 3 more people that I would like to celebrate. Richard Cameron, Anne Fairfax, and Richard Sammons, the founders of the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art. There's a 4th person, Donald Rattner, who was impossible to reach. I think he's out of the picture here. I know that Richard Cameron is here, correct?
I am here.
Is Anne Fairfax, is Richard Sammons, are you here by any chance? So, Richard, this is your turn to tell the history one and only way.
So none of the other founders of the ICA are here, so I can make the whole thing up, and no one will be able to challenge me.
Exactly. This is your.
Well, I was going to just do a quick little, I noticed John Massengale made a great comment in the chat window about how everyone's origin stories are all different, but kind of all the same. And I was thinking while I was listening to Leon, Professor Curl, it's funny how Leon is Leon always, and then Professor Curl is always Professor Curl. We get these things, and then and near, it's funny because when I taught for a little while in Rome, thanks to Thomas Gordon Smith, everywhere I went, I was called dottore, and I only have a couple of minor degrees, but somehow I was conferred an automatic Italian PhD by a teacher there. But I really wanted to speak only briefly. I've done a lot of teaching and a lot of talking, and I think this kind of a forum is fantastic because it's actually a conversation, and this morning. I happened to get on at the exact moment Andreas got on, and we were the only two people on, I think, with someone from, I don't know who it was, from the CPI, and we had a fantastic kind of 5-minute catch up, because I haven't seen Andreas for 25 years, probably since we were all together in Charleston at a conference. And we were talking about how we sat around late one night until way into the wee hours, drinking and smoking cigars. And I thought the best thing that I heard come out of this morning, and there were many, many good things, was the idea of getting together again like that. We used to do that a lot in New York at the ICA. And in fact, although we started it as a place to teach and to talk and present ideas, and to also to advocate for things, which is what most of my career in New York has been about, aside from just making a living and doing architecture. The most fun we had was, late at night at the University Club or downtown at the old Academy of Art when we started, just kind of hanging out with each other. And I realized that listening to this, that the most extraordinary thing I've gained from all of it is a group of friends who are all around the world, who have gone on to do remarkable things. I was at a concert at Carnegie Hall the other night. My childhood friend plays with Montreal Symphony Orchestra, and I heard him play with Yefim Bronfman the other night at Carnegie Hall. We used to go play Nicky Nacky Nine Door together in Hamilton, where I grew up. And then we ended up back at the University Club up till the wee hours, drinking and smoking. And I think that the convocation of people together in person, will take away a lot of our anxiety about whether AI and Chat GPT are going to take away our jobs, because for all that we're here on Zoom and all of these things, it's sitting in a room with a group of like-minded, or even, as Andreas says, not like-minded people, and actually staying in the room for the conversation, the fight, the argument, the drunken ramble, whatever it is, that seems to me to be most key, in fact, about being human and being involved in this field. The great joy of it has been getting to know so many people, from all over the world, some of whom started out as my teachers and mentors. And I was very fortunate growing up in a small town in Canada, that my father, who was a scientist, got the chance to, go and have sabbatical leaves in various places. And so as a kid, I grew up in places like Oxford and Paris and Budapest. And when I wasn't, playing in the ravine behind my little town and my house in my town in Canada. And I guess that gave me a kind of both local and international perspective, which I've valued for the rest of my life. And so to me, the great joy of internationalism is going somewhere and having friends there and, sharing something with them. And I think that Andreas is absolutely right to call this a movement. That's the most extraordinary thing about it. And it's a movement of friends, actually, all around the world, who have been working together now for many decades. I had extraordinary teachers in Toronto. Michael Georgievich was the most important for me, and he's the one that introduced me to classical America, to classicism in general, to the Beaux-Arts, to Leon Krier, to Andreas and Liz, to all of that was brought to me from Michael. We were in the most appalling ideological, mind control, Marxist, Leninist architecture school on the planet, which none of you have ever heard of, but it was the University of Toronto. It was in the hands of a man who had worked for the Smithsons and had been at Columbia, and he came to Toronto and basically captured us all as a bunch of slaves at this. I remember the most vivid experience as an undergraduate was my first year going to a lecture where there were 800 architecture students in this auditorium. This guy whose name was Peter Pragnell, God rest his soul, he died last year, but got us in a room and made us stand up and take the Pledge of Allegiance, that none of us would ever do anything that ever looked like Chatsworth House, forever. And I remember thinking, as I was standing there taking that pledge, why? Like, what, okay, what, why does he hate it so much? Why shouldn't we do that? I've been there. It's incredibly beautiful. And, it's just one of those things that those of us who went through that stuff in the 70s and 80s we're just subjected to, in a way now that actually the whole world is being subjected to this kind of thing, whether it's left or right wing or whatever. Theology is being sold, as the only way forward on so many fronts, whether it's, fronts of war or fronts of pandemic or fronts of anything. And I think it's the one thing I had a natural resistance to. I just don't like being told what to do, frankly. Mm-hmm. And I get that from my parents, who were marvelous parents, and they tried to get me to do all sorts of things, including become an engineer, not an architect. And then they taught me to resist. And I think that the resistance to ideology is probably the most important thing we as a group can do. You know, we can worry a lot about the questions of technology and, you know, AI and all of those things. But at the end of the day, it's our individual freedom that matters most, and our individual freedom to choose our friends, to choose our actions, to choose the things we find beautiful. And we all know what they are. I mean, I remembered as a student realizing that my teachers were telling me to love things that they said were beautiful that we all knew weren't beautiful. And it was literally the emperor's new clothes every day. So I'm very grateful for this award, but mostly I'm grateful for the group of people on this call, many of whom I know and some of whom I don't. And you know, we're going on in New York with the work of trying to get Penn Station rebuilt. Here, I'll do may I do a quick share screen there? You know, this image presents, and you know, we've been
2 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, we've been dedicated to this idea for the last 30 plus years. First of all, because for me, McKimmey and White were the great school of architecture. They when I came to the United States and I had been introduced to their work, I suddenly realized that there was an entire school in the work of their office, which of course was the work of many, many people. And that the best thing that I could do was study what they'd done, which is what we did at the Institute when we founded it with Don and Richard and Ann and Seth and Gil and all of the other people who were involved in founding it. And then people like, you know, Thomas Gordon Smith and Bob Adam and all of the people who came and supported us, and Leon and Andreas and Liz and on and on and on. You know, what we were trying to keep alive in New York was an opportunity to look at this again and learn from it. And so this represents, you know, my attempt to redesign the building for the future, put it back in the city, and then convince everyone here politically, economically, and in every other way that that's in fact the best thing that we could do. We could redress the terrible crime, which was effectively a war crime, of taking this building down, by rebuilding it again and rebuilding Madison Square Garden and rebuilding Madison Square Church and putting those things back as an example of a way that a modern city like New York, which, you know, is a global financial capital, can repair itself and move into the future, so that this would be a modern through-running station with all the latest technology running off geothermal and solar and ultimately nuclear power, whatever we decide to power our things with, but that our vision of being human together is in buildings like this. And that dystopian thing in the background is the stuff we should eventually be demolishing or perhaps recladding, repurposing. A lot of these buildings are now sitting vacant in New York City. And I know developers, some of whom I'm working for right now, who are buying some of these buildings, recladding the building to look more traditional and putting apartments into them to, you know, solve housing issues here. So Nir, thank you. And thank you to the CPI, and it's an amazing, extraordinary organization. I'm looking forward to continuing to work with you for a long time, God willing.
That's the kindest thing I've heard in a while. Thank you very, very much. Can you stop your share, please? Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to do a quick share here. We're going to start the next session in 5 minutes, actually in 4 minutes now. We're catching up, and you will have your full hour because Professor Rybczynski agreed to push his back for another hour after now. So this is where we are at. Richard, thank you. We are, Ann Fairfax and Richard Sammons are not here. People who are very dear to me. They actually had Henry Hope Reed in their office at a desk for, I think it was 10 years, for quite a long time.